Hi, everybody. I'm here with David Lipsky, who is an award-winning author, NYU professor, contributor to Rolling Stone. Most recent book, David, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. Good to see you. What strikes me about this is that, first of all, it's fun. Is it a lighter look at climate denial or just enough with the medicinal stuff?
I think that it's a great story that we've lived through and that all of us have, whether or not we chose to get on this ride, right? We've been on this ride since 1956 when Time magazine said, hey, in about 50 years, according to our best climate scientists, this carbon dioxide could have a violent effect on our weather. And
ergo the parrot, right?
Yes,
the parrot
exactly.
Squawking in the Arctic, in case anybody's wondering where that parrot... Well, I mean, if in the book, in fact, I think you go back to the 1890s when we knew that coal could warm the planet, or at least some scientists were talking about that. I mean, there's such a rich American, maybe you could say global tradition of denial. You know, you talk about cigarettes, the pandemic. We've got plenty of examples there. And of course, climate. You're not a climate journalist. What attracted you to this topic specifically?
Diana, it was the best story. Like, I began working on this book more than 7 years ago, and it was because it was a story that was happening to everybody that we know, and nobody knew what that story was. And then when I began to research it, the actual moment that I decided to write about this, do you know what the charting panel was?
Mm-hmm.
So the charting panel was 44 years ago last week, from the July 23rd of 1979 to July 29th of 1979. The White House asked the National Academy of Sciences, they said to them, hey, is this really going to happen? We've been getting these reports for 20 years, and especially in the last 2 years, of our best scientists saying this looks likely, that if we keep using fossil fuels to power our turbines and then keep all the lights going and to power our nascent computers, that it's going to heat up the planet a little bit, and it might lead to, for example, the storms that we've had on the East Coast and the Midwest for the last couple of weeks, right? Is this true or not? Is this real or not? And so it was an emergency panel. They got together, they got fresh eyes, people who didn't have a stake in it being right or being wrong. And they were like the jury that returns a quick verdict. They wrote back to the White House and they said, this was the Charney panel headed by a great climatologist named Dr. Joel Charney, who 5 years earlier had said, anybody who claims they can tell you more than 2 weeks in advance what the weather is going to be doing is practicing necromancy. But he had been converted by the science.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump. What's interesting is your book kind of predates the Trump administration, and so I want to talk about what's happening right now. We have, the inflow. Americans are moving to some of the hottest parts of the country. We have growing legislation. Certainly, Florida, case in point, this backlash against ESG. So even we don't seem to let facts get in the way of whatever story we want to tell ourselves. Why does this persist?
I think there's money in it. First off, there are corporations that want that. Second off, there's political power, right? And then third, there are people who've become expert on it, and they let it be known that they can assist your cause. And we found it's one of having a scientist say yes or no is one of our most powerful tools of persuasion.
It's interesting. I like the way you portray people in this book. It's sort of gallery of rogues. It is, I think, noirish was one of the terms that one of the reviews used. How would you describe the current cast of characters that we're looking at today? I know that they're not necessarily heavily profiled in the book, but when you look at who would be the particular villains that most intrigue you at the moment?
I would say probably Christopher Monckton, who is a Viscount from England, is still the best denier out there, because he will literally say anything. And about 10 years ago, his data was studied by a climate scientist in England, and he said he's just making it up, and it had no slowing down effect. And Christopher Monckton is interesting for us because he takes a moderate position. First, he was saying the science is wrong. And then as it seemed like the science is right, what he would then say is, look, it's better just to sit back, relax, and enjoy the sunshine. And Christopher Lumpkin is somebody who, before that, tried to create a puzzle that would compete with Rubik's Cube and lost a few million pounds on it. So for me, he's the best because he points out the absurdity of the deniers and also the fact that they are the ones who've been weirdly effective. He was named by the New York Times as among the three global leaders in denialism in the middle of the last decade.
So let's step back a second to let's take the example of cigarettes, because I think that's an interesting one where in fact they won, like they won being, I think the truth actually emerged triumphant in terms of any denialism around the impact that cigarettes have on human health. Are there lessons in that we can take to the climate case, or do you think it's not, that basically at this point most of us now accept that climate's a reality, it's just what we do about it?
There's a huge number of lessons. One of the lessons is that it's the same people who denied on both.
Right.
Especially a man named Dr. S. Fred Singer, who was willing to deny on anything. He was willing to deny that the Moonies, Reverend Moon's old cult, he was willing to say that they were doing wonderful work for science. So the thing we would look at, the best thing, I would say cigarettes are a cautionary tale, because 1964 is when the Surgeon General decides, they decide to have a panel like the Charney panel to say yes or no. They say yes, and then they kept selling them effectively anyway. It took another 40 years, and we don't want that to happen. So the basic lesson about cigarettes is we can look at the strategies they used, and we can say their basic strategy, which is we know we're going to lose the argument if we call for a decision, but if we can just keep the argument going, then we can keep selling our product. And we have to become wiser about that kind of thing, about the people who say, let's just keep researching.
I know that there is obviously a lot of talk about fossil fuel companies and lobbying, and curious what you make of this legislative push against ESG. We're not just seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in Europe, and the pushback is not just coming from fossil fuel companies, it's coming from farmers who say that the standards are too tough in this climate, they can't grow. Does that fit in with because this is a very sweeping history of climate denialism. This latest chapter, is it a logical extension of what you looked at in the book?
Of course, people will, until one of the great things that the Biden administration did with the Inflation Reduction Act is they said, we are going to be doing this. Similarly, California said within about 10 to 13 years, you will not be allowed to sell a gasoline-powered car. When you set actual legislative targets, people adapt to it. It's in the period before that you get a lot of campaigning and a lot of we can't do this and a lot of special exemptions being requested. And that's how I see the push going on now. Is that how you see it too, Diana?
I think that what's interesting about it to me is this divide between the private sector and the public sector, because the private sector, when you talk to CEOs, they very much want to do the right thing because they actually see a business case for it, but they're navigating in the politics of extremism. And so this, whether it's red state, blue state, the culture wars, very similar around ESG. You want to do it, not talk about it, whereas the politicians, I think, are holding on to it as an issue, frankly, to get perhaps their 15 minutes of screen time or whatever. I mean, that's my observation as somebody who's trying to be a neutral observer. I don't know if that's a fair assessment.
I think that what business will always say with any large regulation is there's too much uncertainty. And so they can delay you by saying, okay, we can't plan for the next year, so you have to let us do this because you haven't said when the changes are taking effect. And so what we're seeing is the normal, it's the kind of horse trading that you get. This is essentially horse trading, the ESG.
Yep.
Saying, let us not do this, let us do that, right? And you see it before the end of any session. You might argue that this moment is sort of like the end of a political legislative session.
You know, I feel I'm being a bit unfair to you because it's such a fun story. And here I am talking about it in a way that is very reminiscent of how we always talk about climate, which is we kind of get a bit sad. We look at our feet and it's just like almost existential. Why did you want to make it fun? Why was this? Because it's a yarn. I mean, I really encourage people to read it. It's very novelistic. Just curious why you felt that was the right approach to take.
I think politicians and scheming companies, what they have preyed on throughout the 70 years of America's history with this issue is people not understanding science. There's a great line from Jorge Luis Borges, who is an important librarian in Argentina and a great writer, and he said, the person doesn't exist who outside their specialty is not credulous. And I think corporations and persuaders and thought leaders and politicians take advantage of our not knowing stuff every day. And this was a complicated topic, and it was a science topic, which makes people, that always tends to make people uncomfortable. And so to make it into a story, A, it was a great story anyway, but to B, make it a story where everyone could understand and could see just how long the same arguments have been used, the same delaying tactics, would make it much more difficult for anybody to use it again. Sometimes, yeah. Diana, I would think that, do you know how we feel when we go on a car lot and we may steel ourselves up and take deep breaths and think they're not going to be able to sell us
right.
the rust
I am not taking
right?
the true coat, no true coat, but
yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Yes.
But this was a way, but to tell the story and to make people enjoy the story was a way so that they would never have to buy the true coat again on climate.
Well, but it's not just a lack of comprehension or a intimidation factor. It's the certain anti-elitism streak that fascinates me, where I think the line you use of that climate denial is the broken bottles and roasted, rusted tire smell of the parking lot. Basically, scientists are not welcome. And it is that the scientists are the elite. And to a certain extent, they're making us feel bad about how we live. They're making us feel bad about the American way, about having our cars. That seems to be part of the subtext here of how, frankly, the story is woven very effectively by those who would prefer to maintain the status quo. So,
Diana, that's brilliant. I believe that that has been a tremendous problem for selling solutions. Because it makes people feel like they're at fault, but they're not at fault. One of the very odd things about, and sort of heartening things for me in researching the story, is at every step of the way, whenever there were polls saying, should America take action in 97 during Kyoto, the basic argument that the Republicans had against it was India and China aren't involved. And so Gallup asked, should America take action regardless of what other countries do? And overwhelming numbers said yes. Similarly, in 2007, Americans welcomed immediate action on climate. I think even Republicans. That 2007 was when the IPCC, which, as you know, is the monogram, when they said yes, it's unequivocal. Americans at that point were the number one emitters, but human beings are causing climate change. Americans rose to the occasion and said yes. So I think that there is an anti-elitism streak, but there is also a sense that Americans have, which is we need to do this because it affects our children and it affects their children. But yes, an easy thing that you can do to attack science is to make people say, who are these experts? And that the effectiveness of that strategy, Diana, you're quite right. It comes from the tobacco people. They pioneered it. So it's their strategy. And then it was the people they trained. Once they began to give up in the late 90s, they were hired by the fossil fuel industry.
Yep, anti-vaxxers. I think let's include them on that party too. So let's talk a little bit about what's currently in the news. I'm not going to make you an expert on tornadoes and record heat and everything else, but what have you gleaned from the exercise of writing this book in terms of how you're perceiving the current landscape? What's on your radar you'd put on ours?
For one thing, I think that what COVID showed is that the American people are way more flexible to absolutely changing their basic lifestyle if there is a problem. And if they're told you can be part of the solution to this, everyone was amazingly cooperative. They grumbled, just the way people in uniform grumble, and indeed to some degree like grumbling, right? But they did it. And that is really important for us to think about. Nobody would have believed in January of 2020 that you could get, for 2 years, everybody in the country to stay home. And when they did venture outside, that they would wear a mask. But you got them all to do it. And that is astonishing. So that's one of the main things that I think people should remember when they say we can't change our lifestyle. Could you have imagined that people could live the way they did after 2020?
No, I'm curious how much the political climate impacts your outlook here. Because if we talk about, there's the geopolitical landscape and there's the climate landscape, of course. The geopolitical landscape is very troubling as well when you look at what's happening with who's actually getting to be in charge, the kind of laws they're passing. And I don't know if that's conducive to the sort of change that you think is probably needed to drive a solution many people think is needed.
I think that voters sometimes on some of the bigger issues are ahead of politicians. I think politicians underestimate them. Like, voters were way ahead on gay marriage. They were a decade ahead of where legislators and even the president were, right? So whereas leaders are saying maybe we can't do this since they are often indirectly or directly funded by some of the people who make money from reluctance, I think the voters living through this year, I think we may find that they become a wall against any more delay on this issue. It's been heartening to hear people talking about it this summer.
Any favorite characters? You've got a lot of them in the book, and it could be favorite for whatever reason you choose. You've mentioned a few, but anyone that stands out to you you'd want to mention?
I really like Dr. S. Fred Singer. He is the denier because he denied on acid rain. He was willing to deny that Reverend Sun Myung Moon was a cult leader. He denied on tobacco, and then he became the absolute foundational leader of the global warming deniers. And when he would turn up for conferences in places like Europe, Forbes magazine responded. They said that his appearance was treated as if he were a rock star. And he's just thrilling to read. He's like the Forrest Gump of denial. And it was a thrill to get to write his story. But the truth is, when you get to the denier section of the book, every one of those stories is great because they're so unbelievable. And then knowing that they're true and thinking about how they affected our lives, how they delayed action on this issue for 70 and then especially for 30 years is staggering to me. And then also heroes like Dr. Jim Hansen, who was willing to say in June of 1989, this has started, it's been detected, and it's changing our climate now. Yeah.
I was a college student. I remember doing the Montreal Protocol, doing an article about that. That was actually a successful piece of legislation.
Absolutely.
I don't know how many we've had since, but yet obviously a story that'll continue. Again, it's The Parrot and the Igloo. It's a great book. Thanks for joining us, David.
Dan, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.